Chris POV. As the pillar of fire faded in the distance, Chris couldn't help but feel an involuntary shudder travel down his spine and through his tail. He wasn't sure how he knew, but he could tell that his new boss, Vito, was likely the source of all that fire. Cecil piped up, still staring at the distant horizon, as the black smoke slowly gathered back into a billowing pillar that filled the sky. "Well, it looks like the situation, whatever it was, has likely been resolved," he mused, seemingly relaxed with a small smile, as he leaned back up against the interior of the cart from where he sat. "How can you be so sure of that?" Sarah challenged, quirking a brow at the young mage as she laid on her side, all the while rather casually using Chris's fluffy tail as a sort of pillow. This did earn curious looks from the other adventurers as they also looked at Cecil, expectantly waiting for his response. Chris had a decent understanding of just how strong Vito was due to the bond he formed with him, but how did Cecil know anything about Vito? Had the boss told Cecil something, or did he know something Chris didn't, because he was also a mage? Cecil looked rather smug at the attention, smiling as he looked among the others. "He's got a lot going for him after all, and told me how he was trained by elves for the last several decades in the ways of magic." "Like actual elves? Not some kind of half-elves or something?" Rance asked curiously, looking rather surprised by the revelation. Cecil nodded intently. "Yeah, and you've heard the stories. How they weave their hidden cities in deep and uncharted lands using the very nature around them. Following their mysterious methods, he's already managed to form his third mana ring around his heart." "Wait, what? Is that true?" Ren piped up suddenly, looking up from her chess game with Lily. Chris was mildly surprised by Ren's outburst, looking over at his little sister as he tilted his head curiously. "What's got you all riled up?" He could see the excitement plain on her face, along with a hint of confusion, as if she didn't believe what she just heard. It's strange though, it was almost like he could sense her surprise before she said anything. As everyone turned to look at Ren, she suddenly seemed rather sheepish under all the attention, though she soon managed to still her nerves as she focused on Chris, and decided to just explain what was on her mind to him. "If what Cecil is saying is right, then Vito is at the pinnacle of what only a few short-lived mages can reach. I wonder if that's what he meant when he said that," she considered before trailing off. Chris recalling the conversation they had last night with Vito, saying something about how he used to be human. Cecil looked pleasantly surprised and almost delighted to Chris's eyes, as the mage regarded Ren. "You're rather knowledgeable about magic. Are you perhaps studying to become a mage?" Now it was Chris's turn to be surprised. Sure, Ren had a mana heart now, but was that really enough to just become a mage? He looked over to Ren, who had an equally surprised if not confused expression on her face, as she looked between him and Cecil, stammering for more than a few moments, as her cheeks flushed with embarrassment at the sudden attention that was back on her again. "Well, no. I just don't have a lot to do all day, so I just read a lot to pass the time. I came across that info some time ago, but I suppose I never thought I could actually apply it. Until now, at least." "Oh, did you develop a mana heart recently? How'd you do it?" Rance asked, looking intrigued by the line of conversation. At that, Ren shot Chris a glance, and he could almost feel her uncertainty, like she wasn't sure what to say, which was reasonable enough. While Vito didn't explicitly say to not talk about what happened last night, given the secretive nature of whatever he did to give both of them mana hearts, he was likely using a technique that wasn't widely known, so she didn't know how to explain herself. Chris decided to take the attention from her as he spoke up. "I helped her do it," he said simply at first. This did earn him some slight side-eye from both Sarah and Zax, but they kept their mouths shut, and their thoughts to themselves. "Really? Does that mean you also have a mana heart? Well, of course you do, if you helped her do it. Though, was she able to develop it naturally through simple meditation, or was it some other method? Rance considered, before flashing a bit of a smile. Are you trying to get her to follow your line of work? Chris could tell that Rance was just being curious and making casual conversation, though he couldn't help but react a little too sharply at the idea of Ren becoming a thief like him, not to mention all the questions. No, of course not, he replied harshly, narrowing his gaze, drawing his ears back and glaring at the adventurer, despite already rationalizing that Rance meant no offense. She'll never do the work that I do, I won't let her, he said firmly, or straightening his back and sitting a little taller. Rance simply held his hands up in a rather placating way, and Chris could see the confusion on his face as Rance glanced at the others. Whoa, guy, I didn't mean anything by it, but she's got a mana heart now. That alone opens up a lot of doors that aren't available to the average person. It would be a shame to not capitalize on it. Chris couldn't argue with that. It was true, after all. And Vito did say she should be able to live like others her age, now that she does have a mana heart. Chris also couldn't help but be a little overprotective of her, as he practically raised her himself for most of her life, especially after their dad up and disappeared on them. Glancing over at Ren, she flashed a little smile as she scratched her cheek, and decided to voice her own opinion. I actually have some potential work lined up working at one of the guilds as either a receptionist or scribe of some kind, thanks to one of my tutors. Though, that was before I developed a mana heart, so I'm not really sure how that changes things. Cecil pitched in at that. While those are both certainly respectable trades, you could do so much more, especially if you have an aptitude for magic, he said, as he leaned back against the carriage wall. You could become a healer, or maybe an artificer, or even some kind of researcher or scholar in various branches of magic, he explained rather excitedly, as he glanced between Chris and Ren. There's a lot of paths for her to take where she doesn't have to put her life at risk, if that's what you're worried about. Being a wandering adventurer like myself was pretty close to the bottom of the list for a majority of the mages that I knew, back at the academy. Looking at Ren, Chris could tell she was more than a little overwhelmed at the possibilities, glancing between him and Cecil, but unsure of what to say. Chris decided to speak up as he regarded Cecil this time. If that's what she wants for her future, and if it's even available to her, then I'll do all that I can to make sure she gets that chance. In the meantime, I have no plans or intentions to pressure her into anything. She's gone through a lot of changes recently and needs time to figure herself out, so if you don't mind, just drop this subject, he said, doing his best to be firm without sounding overly sensitive or upset. It seemed to do the trick, as Cecil just nodded in response. Of course, there's no rush after all. You have your whole life ahead of you in the end, he mused kindly, as he looked over to Ren while flashing a kind smile. Chris couldn't help but find that comment at least a little odd, coming from someone who was both younger than him, and only a few years older than Ren herself. Regardless, the topic was dropped, and without the distant threat seemingly having been handled, the group went back to their games and pastimes for the next hour. That was until Riley spoke up. Eyes up, everybody. We have somebody running towards us, the Rabbitkin woman said, shifting around up front and squinting as she looked ahead of them. At that, everyone started getting to their feet where they could, checking their weapons and armor. Though while they did that, the dogkin archer, Lily, made her way up front and looked ahead where Riley had spotted the rider. After a moment, she seemingly relaxed before looking at Rance. Wolf, she stated simply, as she shrugged off her quiver and went back to sitting where she had been earlier. Oh, it's just Vito's wolf? Rance clarified, taking a moment to look out the front and peek for himself, before just nodding intently. You're right, but that isn't Vito riding him. I wonder what happened, he said while trailing off, relaxing as well, as he set aside his sword and shield. How can you even see that far? I can barely make out the shape, Riley said with mild disbelief, glancing back at the adventurers before looking ahead again and squinting some more. Just a lot of practice and training, Rance mused as he settled down again, shoulder to shoulder with Lily, and got comfortable once more. Despite everyone else mostly relaxing, Chris decided to remain particularly vigilant, climbing up front and keeping Riley company, as he watched Lugosi make their way towards them at a rather steady pace. Much to his surprise, he came to realize that his own vision had significantly improved, being able to make out the wolf and the rider with relative ease the more he intentionally focused on them. Or maybe it was because they were getting closer outright. Well, either way, he would need to practice and see just what he could do now that he had a man heart of his own. The next 10 minutes came and went rather quickly, as a blooded Cat King girl who had been riding Lugosi came up beside the caravan. Riley brought the caravan to a stop as she looked over the teenage girl, though before she could say anything, the girl spoke up. "Do you have any food and water you can spare? Lugosi said I could have some once we got to this caravan," she said rather bluntly, a clear and distinct tiredness to her voice, and in the way she carried herself. Riley went to speak, sounding rather official at first, as she looked the catkin in her eyes. "You are riding Mr. Vito's familiar and have approached his caravan. Who are you, and... Did you say the wolf talked?" she asked, sounding sincerely confused by what she just heard. Chris had to agree. Not sure if he heard the girl properly, as he looked at Lugosi curiously, the wolf meeting his gaze with a surprising amount of intelligence behind their eyes, and offering a small and almost charming-looking smile. "Did I fucking stutter?" The catkin bit back harshly and irritably, sitting taller on Lugosi's back despite the clear exhaustion in her voice. "I fought for my life, lost a lot of blood, and thankfully had my wounds magically treated. I'm exhausted, thirsty, and fucking starving. Do you have food and water to spare, or are you making a liar out of Lugosi?" she stated, sliding off the wolf's back and standing firmly on her own 2 feet, as her tail lashed behind her. Riley was suitably taken aback as far as Chris could tell, opening and closing her mouth a few times as she tried to put together a response. However, she didn't answer quickly enough as the catkin took 2 steps forward, pulled a palm-sized badge from a pouch on her hip, and held it out for Riley and Chris to see. Clear as day were the markings of a rank-3 elite. This badge in particular was a version for family members in an elite household, not necessarily the head of the household or the elite who earned the status for their family. "I am Puma Swiftstrike, only daughter to Tormy Swiftstrike of the retired silver-ranked adventuring party, Swift Strikers. Using the authority and influence granted to me by my mother's blood and contributions to society, I am commandeering your caravan due to the dire circumstances I find myself in," she ordered, with a surprising amount of authority. "Now then, if you don't mind, get me some fucking food," she said, with distinct venom in her voice, before dialing it back and relaxing a bit. "Please? I'll pay you back once we return to my home." Riley stiffened with surprise before lowering her head, out of the respect that is due to someone of Puma's standing. Of course, ma'am, please, if you'll follow me," she said, hopping down from the cart before leading Puma to the rear carriage. Chris watched as his team and the adventurers climbed out from the carriage to stretch their legs, and gawk at the young elite they just encountered, leaving him alone with Lugosi, who was now lying in the grass while panting softly. "So, can you talk?" he asked after a couple of quiet minutes. Lugosi stopped panting, looking over at Chris before smiling again. "Well, of course I can. Why shouldn't I?" he mused in a distinctly masculine voice, before going back to panting. Chris blinked with surprise, but played it cool, as he simply shrugged a bit. "Well, I don't know, because you're a wolf?" Lugosi just smiled some more. "Ah, but I'm not just a wolf. I'm born to the boss Vito, just like you," he said, seemingly stumbling on his words for a moment. "So, Vito is likely an alias that his new boss is using," Chris wasn't really all too surprised by the idea, but he was curious as to why someone as strong as he would hide his identity. Of course, there were likely all sorts of reasons, but it didn't matter to Chris in the here and now. "Well, Lugosi, it's good to finally speak to you properly. I hope we get along," Chris said kindly, as he even offered a small smile. Lugosi just bobbed his head, smiling still, as his tail began to slowly wag. "It's good to speak to you too, Chris. Now then, can you get me some water too? I've been running quite a lot, you know," Lugosi mentioned cheerfully enough, before getting comfortable as he laid his head along his forelegs. "Ah, sure. Be right back," Chris replied dutifully, as he hopped down from the front of the carriage and made his way toward the others.